The dust had not even begun to settle when Marshal Prescott realized he had just been beaten by a woman he had never seen before in his life. And he knew, with a certainty that hit him harder than any fall from a horse ever had, that he needed to know her name before she disappeared into that golden horizon. It was the summer of 1878, deep in the New Mexico territory, in a town called Redrock that had grown up fast and wild along the banks of the Rio Salado, the kind of place where cattlemen and prospectors and drifters all shared the same dusty main street without much ceremony. The town had a post office, 2 saloons, a general store, a livery stable, and a reputation for producing some of the finest riders in the whole Southwest. And among all those riders, among every man who had ever swung a leg over a saddle between Santa Fe and the Texas border, Marshal Prescott was considered the finest of them all. He was 26 years old, broad-shouldered and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn leather vest, and eyes the color of strong coffee on a cold morning. He had grown up on horseback, the son of a rancher who had come west from Tennessee before the war and carved out 2,000 acres of scrub and pasture through sheer stubbornness. Marshall had been riding since before he could properly walk, and by the time he was 16, he was breaking horses that other men would not go near. He had a way with them, a quiet patience that the animals seemed to feel before he even touched them, and it translated into a speed on the open range that had never been properly matched. Every year on the 4th of July, Redrock held its annual territorial race. It was not a formal affair with betting slips and official rules, though plenty of money changed hands informally in the street beforehand. It was a flat race, 2 miles out along the river road and 2 miles back, and it drew riders from 3 counties. Marshall had won it 4 years running, and by the summer of 1878, winning it had begun to feel like something he did as naturally as breathing. He arrived at the starting line that morning on his gray stallion Cannon, who was 17 hands of pure muscle, and had never once let him down, and he surveyed the other riders with the calm confidence of a man who already knew the outcome. There were 12 riders that year, which was more than usual. He recognized most of them. Hector Vega from the Double V spread, who was a fine horseman but always pulled up cautious in the second mile. Old Pete Simmons on his black quarter horse, who was more interested in the glory of the race than the finish. The Carver brothers, 2 of them, tall and grim-faced on a pair of matching roans. And then there was the 13th rider, who arrived late, pushing through the crowd on the edge of the street, and who drew every eye in the gathering like a magnet draws iron. She rode a Palomino mare of extraordinary build, the color of fresh honey, with a white mane that lifted in the morning breeze like something out of a story. The rider herself sat in the saddle with the kind of effortless authority that could not be taught, that came only from years and years of quiet, private understanding between a person and a horse. She was wearing a plain dark riding skirt and a cream-colored blouse with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and her brown hair was braided and pinned under a wide-brimmed hat that had clearly seen years of hard use. She was perhaps 22 or 23, and her face was composed and direct, with dark eyes that moved over the assembled riders without a trace of nervousness. Marshall looked at her and felt something shift in his chest in a way he could not immediately explain. One of the race organizers, a round man named Dale Fitch who sweated heavily in even mild weather, walked over to the new arrival with an expression of polite concern. "Miss, the race is for men," he began. The woman looked at him steadily. "I don't see that written anywhere," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried, with just the faintest trace of a Georgia accent that had been worn smooth by western wind. Dale Fitch opened and closed his mouth twice. The crowd had grown attentive. Marshall watched from atop Cannon without moving. It was Hector Vega who laughed first, not unkindly. "Let her ride," he called out. "If she finishes, she finishes." There was a general murmur of amusement and agreement from the crowd, the kind that assumed the matter was settled before it had properly begun, the kind that expected the woman to either be humiliated or to gracefully withdraw at some point in the first quarter mile. Marshall said nothing. He watched the woman settle deeper into her saddle, adjust the reins with practiced hands, and turn her palomino to face the road. Whatever she was thinking, she kept it behind her eyes. The starting pistol belonged to Sheriff Cole Radnor, a thin, sun-darkened man in his 50s who had been presiding over this race for a decade. He raised it, paused long enough for the horses to still, and fired. Cannon launched off the line with the controlled explosion Marshall had trained him for, and the field spread out behind them in the familiar way, the stronger riders pulling to the front, the weaker ones already falling back. Hector Vega was to his left, pushing hard. One of the Carver brothers was somewhere behind them, and Marshall could hear the pounding of a dozen sets of hooves competing with the roar of the crowd on the edges of the road. He did not think about the woman. He focused on the road, on the line of the river bend ahead, on the rhythm of cannon beneath him. He hit the halfway mark, the old cottonwood tree that served as the turning point, in first place by 2 clear lengths. He wheeled Cannon with the precision of long practice, and drove back down the road toward the finish line with everything he had. It was in the last quarter mile that he heard it, the sound of hooves coming up fast on his right, faster than anything he had heard behind him in 4 years of winning this race, and he turned his head just enough to see the Palomino mare drawing level with Cannon, and then, impossibly, pulling past him, the woman's body low over the horse's neck, her braided hair loose now and flying, her face set with a concentration that was almost frightening in its purity. She crossed the finish line 3 lengths ahead of him. The crowd was silent for exactly 2 seconds, and then it erupted. Marshall brought Cannon to a stop and sat there for a moment in the churning dust, listening to the noise around him, which was a strange mixture of astonishment and delight, and from some quarters, a thinly veiled outrage that he chose to ignore. He felt something strange happen inside him, something that was not quite humiliation and not quite simple surprise, but was more like the feeling of stepping through a door you had thought was a wall and finding yourself somewhere entirely new and unexplored. He swung down from Cannon and walked forward through the settling dust toward the woman, who had pulled her Palomino to a gentle stop and was sitting quietly while people crowded and shouted around her. He stopped at the mare's shoulder and looked up. She looked down at him, and the direct, measuring quality of her gaze was the same up close as it had been from a distance. There was no smugness in it, but there was no false modesty either. She had ridden to win and she had won, and she seemed to consider that a straightforward fact. "What is your horse's name?" Marshall asked, because it seemed like the right starting place. "Sable," the woman said, "though she is not black, I know. My father named her when she was a foal and he was feeling contrary. She is the finest mare I have ever seen." "She is," the woman agreed simply. The dust was still hanging in the air around them, golden in the morning sun, and the crowd was still making its noise, and in the middle of all of it Marshall looked at this woman and asked the question that was already burning in him. "What is your name?" She studied him for a moment, as though assessing whether the question deserved an answer, or perhaps assessing the quality of the man asking it. "Ada Carver," she said. Marshall turned that name over in his mind once. "You are related to the Carver brothers who rode today." "They are my brothers," Ada said. "James and Henry, and you are Marshall Prescott. You know who I am." "Everyone in 3 counties knows who you are," she said without particular inflection. "You are the man who was just beaten." There was a pause, and then Marshall Prescott did something he had not done in a long time. He laughed, a real one, not the polite variety he used in company, but the kind that came from somewhere genuine. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what I am." Ada Carver looked at him for another moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly, in a way that was not quite a smile and was not quite not one either. That was where it began. The annual race prize was a small silver cup and $20 in cash, which Dale Fitch presented to Ada with the resigned formality of a man who had not planned this particular outcome. She accepted both with quiet dignity. Her brothers, James and Henry, stood nearby with expressions that were difficult to read. They were large men, both of them, with their father's square jaw and their mother's watchful eyes, and they appeared to regard the whole situation, including Marshal Prescott's approach to their sister, with careful neutrality. After the presentation, the crowd dispersed toward the saloons and the general store, and Marshall found an opportunity he was not entirely sure he had engineered or simply stumbled into, walking beside Ada as she led Sable toward the livery stable. "How long have you been in the territory?" he asked. "For months," Ada said. "We came from Georgia. My father died last winter, the farm was sold against debt, and James decided the family ought to try New Mexico." She said all of this with the directness of someone who had long since stopped pretending the circumstances were other than they were. "I am sorry about your father. He was a good man," Ada said, "and a good horseman. He taught me everything I know about riding, though I suspect Sable taught me some things too. Where are you situated now? Have you got land?" "We are renting from old Bill Hartley out on the East Fork. 40 acres of poor grass, but James says there is potential." She glanced at him sideways. "We are not your concern, Mr. Prescott." "I did not say you were," Marshall said mildly. "I was asking out of interest." Ada stopped at the entrance to the livery and turned to look at him fully. She was not quite as tall as he had assumed on horseback, but she held herself with a kind of quiet assurance that made the question of height seem irrelevant. "What is your interest, Mr. Prescott? You lost a race to a stranger and now you are following her to the stable." He met her gaze without flinching. "I would like to know you better," he said. "That is the plain truth of it." Ada appeared to consider this. Then she said, "Are you in the habit of asking to know women better after they defeat you?" "I have never been defeated before," Marshall said, "so I could not say." She was quiet for a moment, and he thought he might have overplayed his hand. Then she said, "I will be in town next Saturday for supplies. If you happen to be at the general store around noon, I would not consider it an intrusion." And with that she led Sable inside the stable, and Marshal Prescott stood in the warm July sunshine, with the clear understanding that he had been given exactly as much encouragement as Ada Carver had decided to give, and not one syllable more. He rode home to the Prescott ranch that afternoon in a state of mind he could not quite name. The ranch was 4 miles north of Red Rock, a solid operation with good cattle and well-maintained buildings, running on land his father had broken, and that Marshall had expanded over the past 3 years since his father's passing. He had a foreman named Walt Gaines who handled the day-to-day management with quiet competence, and 2 full-time hands besides. By the standards of the territory, it was a prosperous place, and Marshall had always felt settled within it, comfortable in his work and his life. But as he unsaddled Cannon in the cool of the barn that evening, he found himself thinking about a woman he had known for less than 2 hours with an intensity that was, frankly, unreasonable, and he knew it, and he went on thinking about her anyway. He did not tell Walt about the race. Walt heard about it from someone in town before dark and came to find him at the fence line with the expression of a man trying very hard not to laugh. "I hear you got run down," Walt said. "You heard correctly," Marshall said. "By a woman." "By an exceptional rider," Marshall said precisely, "who happens to be a woman." Walt chewed on that for a moment. And nothing. It was a fair race." Walt studied the middle distance. "Tom Hewson says he is going to demand a rematch on account of some irregularity in the starting." Marshall felt a flare of irritation so sharp it surprised him. "There was no irregularity. She won clean and fair, and anyone who says otherwise will hear about it from me personally." Walt raised his eyebrows but said nothing more, which was one of the qualities Marshall valued most in him. The following Saturday, Marshall arrived at the Red Rock General Store at 11:30, which was early enough that it could not be considered suspicious, and late enough that it was not obviously anxious. He told himself he was there to order a new length of fence wire and a sack of dried beans, which was true, and he told himself this was the primary reason for the visit, which was less true. Ada arrived 12 minutes after noon on Sable, with her brother Henry riding beside her on one of the matching roans. Henry Carver regarded Marshall with the careful neutrality he had shown at the race, shook his hand with a grip that communicated several things at once, and then found an excuse to go look at a bridle in the far corner of the store with the patient unhurriedness of a man giving space without losing sight. Ada and Marshall stood together near the seed bins, surrounded by the smell of flour and tobacco and fresh lumber, and talked for 45 minutes. He learned that she was 23 years old, that she had spent her childhood in the red clay hills of Georgia, that she could read and write and do figures, that she had opinions about the proper management of pasture land that were more informed than those of most ranchers he knew, and that she had a laugh, when she finally produced one, that was low and genuine and made him feel as though the room had gotten somehow warmer. She learned, or seemed to learn, that he was not merely the man who had lost a race, that he had substance and thought and a genuine love for the land he worked. He told her about his father, about building the ranch up from what it had been, about his plans for improving the cattle stock with some breeding animals he had been considering from a man in Texas. She asked questions that were specific and intelligent, and he found himself talking more freely than he was accustomed to, more honestly, as though the brevity of her manner had somehow removed the usual social padding from the conversation. When Henry drifted back from the bridle corner with the look of a man whose patience had reached its natural conclusion, Ada put her hand out to shake Marshall's, and he took it, feeling the calluses on her palm that came from real work with horses and rope, and said, "Next Saturday." "I expect I will need supplies next Saturday as well," Ada said. Henry's expression as he held the door for his sister contained, Marshall thought, the faintest suggestion of amusement. The Saturdays became a ritual. Then they became 2 days a week. Then Marshall found himself riding out to the East Fork property on a Tuesday in August, with a perfectly legitimate question about fence lines that bordered both properties, which was true in the loosest geographical sense, and which gave him an excuse to stand at the gate of the Hartley place for half an hour while Ada leaned on the top rail, and argued the merits of various grass types with a passion that would have surprised anyone who had not yet discovered that she held strong opinions on agricultural matters. James Carver watched him from the porch of the small house with an expression that was thoughtful and not unfriendly. Later, when Marshall was getting back on Cannon to leave, James came down to the gate with the deliberate pace of a man who had decided to speak his mind. He was a few years older than Ada, perhaps 27 or 28, with a steadiness about him that Marshall respected. "My sister is not a woman who is impressed easily," James said, "and she is not a woman who tolerates being trifled with." "I have noticed both of those things," Marshall said. James looked at him for a moment. "She lost her father, her home, everything familiar. She came here because I asked her to, and she came without complaint, and she has worked harder than any man on this place since we arrived. She deserves something that is real." "I understand that," Marshall said, and he meant it completely. James nodded, slow and deliberate. "Then come to supper on Friday," he said. "Henry cooks a passable stew." Henry's stew was, in fact, excellent, and the evening was the kind that Marshall carried home with him like a lamp in his chest, warm and steady. They sat at the small table in the rented house, the four of them, and the conversation ranged from the practical to the funny to the serious. And Ada across the table from him laughed at something Henry said about a stubborn mule they had acquired, and the sound of it filled the low-ceilinged room and made the lamplight seem brighter. He rode home in the dark along the river road, and the stars over the desert were the same stars they had always been, but he could not stop looking at them. August became September, and September was the month of the big cattle drive through the territory, when the good night-loving trail brought large herds through from Texas, and the ranchers along the river road spent long days managing their own stock to keep them clear of the drives. It was hard work and dry work, and the territory was full of dust, and the sound of cattle and the smell of them. And in the middle of it all, Marshall found himself making time, deliberately and without apology, to see Ada whenever he could manage it. She had, he discovered, taken on work training horses for the Hartley operation, and for a neighbor named Carson, who raised cutting horses for sale. She was good at it in a way that went beyond good, and Carson had begun paying her a fair wage for it, which was unusual enough in 1878 that people in town had opinions about it. Opinions that Ada received with the same calm indifference she seemed to apply to most of what people in town had opinions about. Marshall had no opinion about it except that he admired her for it and said so plainly. "People talk," Ada said one afternoon. They were standing at the Carson corral watching a young bay gelding work through a pattern she had been teaching him, and the late September light was golden and long across the desert scrub. "Mrs. Fitch says it is not suitable. Mrs. Fitch has never sat on a horse that did not bore her within 10 minutes, Marshall said. Her opinion of what is suitable in a saddle is not worth much. Ada smiled at that, the full one this time, the one that reached her eyes. "You are protective of my reputation," she observed. "I am protective of you," Marshall said, and the words came out more plainly than he had planned, but he did not take them back. Ada was quiet for a moment, watching the bay gelding. Then she said, "Marshall." "Yes." "What is this?" she asked. "What are we doing here?" He turned to look at her. She was still watching the horse, her profile against the September sky, and her expression was the one she used when she was being precise about something, when she was cutting away the unnecessary parts to get to the thing that mattered. He said, "I think you know what this is." "I know what I think it is," Ada said. "I want to know what you think." He thought about how to say it right. He was not an unthoughtful man, but he was not a naturally eloquent one, and this seemed to require both thoughtfulness and some form of eloquence. "When I came over that finish line in July and found you already there," he said, "I thought I had stepped off the edge of the world. And then I looked at you and thought that maybe I had simply stepped off the edge of the world I had known and onto one that was bigger." Ada turned to look at him then. Whatever she had been braced for, he suspected it had not been quite that. "That is a remarkable thing to say," she said quietly. "I have been thinking about it for 2 months," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, and there was something happening in her face that she was not entirely hiding, a kind of softening, a lowering of the careful reserve she wore like a second skin. "I was not in Georgia when my father died," she said suddenly, as if the words had been waiting. "I was in Atlanta, working for a woman who ran a small dress shop. I had gone because I needed to be useful and the farm could not support all of us. James sent me a letter and it took 3 weeks to reach me, and by the time I got home he had already been buried." She paused. "I came west because I could not be in Georgia anymore. There was too much loss in the ground there." "I know something about loss in the ground," Marshall said. "My father is in it." She looked at him. "Is that why you work so hard for him?" "For him and for myself. Both are true." He hesitated. "Ada, I would like to court you properly, with your brother's knowledge and approval. I am not trying to sneak around the edges of something. I am telling you directly what I want." Ada was quiet for a long moment, and the bay gelding tossed his head in the corral and a crow called somewhere in the mesquite, and the whole wide territory seemed to be holding its breath. "James already likes you," she said at last. "Henry thinks you are decent. I think you are honest, which is rarer than decent." "And what else do you think?" Another pause. "I think that Sable likes Cannon," she said, with a deliberateness that was almost playful, "which is a reasonable beginning." Marshall laughed and she laughed, and it was the kind of moment that does not need anything added to it. He spoke to James that same evening, formally and without pretense. James listened to him with his arms crossed and his eyes steady, and then asked 3 direct questions about the state of the ranch's finances, about Marshall's intentions regarding permanence in the territory, and about whether Marshall understood that Ada was not a woman who could be managed. Marshall answered all 3 honestly, and James extended his hand. "Henry, when informed, said only, "Good. Now maybe he will stop finding excuses to talk about fence lines." The courtship, properly begun, had the quality of something that had been in motion for a long time already, that was catching up to where it had always been going. They rode together along the river road in the cool of the mornings, sometimes for miles without needing to fill the silence with words, which was the best kind of riding and, Marshall suspected, the best kind of company. Ada had opinions about everything and shared them without apology, and he had learned that the best response to them was not to concede or to argue automatically, but to think about them properly, because she was right more often than she was wrong, and she noticed when you were not actually listening. He brought her to the Prescott ranch for the first time on a warm Saturday in October, and she walked through the main house with the quiet attention of someone who was genuinely looking rather than merely appearing to look. And she stood at the kitchen window that looked out over the north pasture and said, "You could run twice as many cattle on this north field if you rotated the grazing properly." "I know," Marshall said. "I have been meaning to fence it off in sections. The grass on the west side is already overgrazed." "I know that too," he said with some amusement. She turned from the window. "You need a partner," she said, and it was ambiguous in the best possible way, the kind of statement that meant exactly what it said and also meant considerably more. He looked at her standing in his kitchen in the October light, and the feeling he had carried since July, the one he had been adding to daily without quite naming it, resolved itself into something unmistakable and clear. He crossed the room and stood before her and said, "Ada Carver, I am in love with you. I want you to know it plainly so there is no confusion." Her chin came up slightly, and her eyes were bright with something she was very close to not restraining. "There is no confusion," she said softly. "I have been in love with you since you walked through the dust after that race and asked my horse's name before you asked mine." "I did not ask your horse's name first," he said, startled. "You did," she said with conviction. "You asked what Sable was called, and then you said she was fine, and then you asked my name." He thought back and discovered that she was absolutely right, and he was not sure whether to be embarrassed or to simply accept it as perfectly representative of his character in that moment. "I was somewhat overwhelmed," he said, "by losing," she asked with that precise edge. "By you," he said. And he kissed her then, for the first time, which was long overdue by any reasonable accounting, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything she did. And when they were done standing in his kitchen in the warm October afternoon, the north pasture visible through the window, still overgrazed, still needing work, the whole ranch stretched out around them with its ordinary necessity and beauty, Marshall Prescott thought that he had never in his life been so completely certain of anything. They were engaged before November. He produced a ring that had been his mother's, a small ruby set in yellow gold that had been given to his father in Tennessee before the war, and had come west in a tin box wrapped in a piece of wool cloth. He had kept it in the same tin box in the drawer of his writing desk, not quite knowing why, not quite knowing for whom, until now. Ada held it in her palm and looked at it for a long moment with a quality of stillness that he had come to recognize as the way she looked at things that mattered to her. "It is beautiful," she said. "It was my mother's." She looked up. "You are sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything," he said. She put it on her finger herself, which seemed right. James and Henry were told that evening, and both of them received the news with the expressions of men who had seen it coming from a significant distance. Henry opened a bottle of rye whiskey he had been keeping for an occasion and poured 4 glasses, and they drank together in the small rented house with its one good lamp and the sound of the desert wind outside, and it was as fine an engagement party as any Marshall could have imagined. But a good story rarely runs smooth all the way, and the territory was not finished with them yet. The trouble arrived in the form of a man named Cole Drummond, which was the name of the largest landowner in the eastern part of Cochise County, a man who ran cattle on 60,000 acres, and who had been, it turned out, in the process of acquiring the Hartley lease and the land around it before the Carvers had arrived and complicated his plans. Drummond was not a violent man by nature, but he was accustomed to getting what he wanted through the quiet application of economic pressure, and he was not above using legal mechanisms to achieve what plain request could not. He served James Carver with a paper in early November that challenged the validity of the lease arrangement and claimed prior claim on the eastern 40 acres. It was a thin legal argument, manufactured by a lawyer in Santa Fe who worked for Drummond on retainer, but it was enough to create real uncertainty, and James came to Marshall with it looking worried in a way that James Carver, who was not a man easily worried, rarely permitted himself to appear. Marshall read the paper twice and then rode into Reed Rock and found the one man he knew who understood territorial land law, which was a retired surveyor named August Fielding who had spent 20 years mapping property claims across 3 territories and who lived in a house behind the church with approximately 600 books and an extremely well-trained memory. August read the document, asked 3 questions, and then said, "It is constructed to confuse, but the underlying claim is weak. The original Hartley deed supersedes this by 10 years. The question is whether the Carvers have a recorded lease agreement which would give them standing to contest. Do they need a lawyer?" Marshall asked. "They need the original Hartley deed and a copy of their lease agreement filed with the county recorder in Las Cruces," August said. "If those documents are in order, Drummond's claim falls apart." The ride to Las Cruces was 3 days each way, and the county record's office was a small, underfunded room in the back of the courthouse staffed by a single overworked clerk named Patterson who regarded every new arrival as a personal imposition. But Patterson knew his records, and after 2 hours of searching produced both the Hartley deed and a recorded copy of the Carver lease that had been filed in September by old Bill Hartley himself, who was, it turned out, not a man who had gotten old in the West by being careless about his paperwork. Marshall rode back to Reed Rock with the documents in his saddlebag and a clarity of purpose that had burned through the 3-day return ride like a clean fire. He delivered them to James, who took them to the sheriff, who sent a copy to Drummond's lawyer, and the claim dissolved within 2 weeks without further contest. Drummond, informed by his lawyer that the case was without merit, withdrew it with the silence of a man who had lost a hand of cards and intended to forget he had played it. Ada heard the full account when Marshall returned, and she stood at the gate of the Hartley place and listened without interrupting, and when he was done she said, "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said. "You rode 6 days and argued with bureaucrats for my family's security." "Yes," he said simply. She looked at him for a long, clear moment. "Marshall Prescott," she said, "I am going to marry you and that is the end of it." "I was hoping you would say something like that," he said. She reached up and took hold of the front of his jacket and pulled him down to her level, and kissed him with a warmth and a conviction that said everything that needed saying. They were married on the 14th of December, 1878, in the small clapboard church in Reed Rock, in front of perhaps 50 people, which was most of the town's permanent population, and a number of ranchers who had ridden in from outlying areas because news traveled fast in the territory, and people were, apparently, invested in this particular outcome. Reverend Thomas Howell performed the ceremony with the brisk warmth of a man who genuinely enjoyed his work. James gave Ada away with an expression of careful dignity that cracked when Ada squeezed his hand at the altar, and he had to look at the ceiling for a moment. Henry had gone to Las Cruces in November and come back with a length of white fabric that Ada had made into a simple dress with the help of a woman in town named Rosa Medina, who had a sewing machine and strong opinions about necklines, and the result was something spare and beautiful that suited Ada exactly. Marshall stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle and thought about that morning in July, the dust and the astonishment and the particular quality of the light over the race road, and the name she had given him before the dust had even settled, and how impossible it was that he should be standing here now with all of this consequence and joy stemming from a single flat race in the summer heat. And yet here he was, and here she was. And the mathematics of it were entirely beyond him and entirely right. He said his vows carefully, meaning every word. She said hers looking directly at him with those dark, honest eyes, and her voice did not waver once. They were married. The reception was held in the street outside the church, because the building was far too small for the crowd, and someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a banjo. And by the time the sun was low, the dancing had gotten considerably more energetic than was strictly consistent with the solemnity of the occasion. And Marshall danced with Ada under the cold December stars and the lamplight spilling from the saloon windows. And he held her with both hands and thought that this was what it felt like to be fully present in a moment, to be entirely somewhere rather than partly somewhere and partly in the future or the past. Happy, he said against her hair. Extremely, she said. Ada moved into the Prescott ranch the following week, and the process of this revealed something that Marshall had half known but not quite articulated, which was that Ada Carver, now Ada Prescott, was not a woman who occupied space passively. Within 10 days, she had reorganized the kitchen storage in a way that was objectively superior to the previous arrangement, had begun the fencing project on the north pasture that they had discussed in October, and had established a working agreement with Carson to continue training cutting horses 3 days a week, to which Marshall had no objection whatsoever, and which added a useful income to the ranch's accounts. Walt Gaines, the foreman, met her on the second day and spent approximately 15 minutes in her company before coming to find Marshall with the expression of a man who had reassessed a situation. "She is something," Walt said. "I know," Marshall said. "She told me the east fence post alignment was off by half a degree and showed me with a level." "Was she right?" "Yes," Walt said without rancor. "She was completely right." They settled into the life of the ranch through the winter months, and it was not always easy, because two strong-willed people in close quarters in the middle of a New Mexico winter with hard work and cold nights will inevitably find each other's sharp edges, and they found theirs. They argued twice, with the genuine heat of two people who each thought they were right about something important, once about the proper management of the stallion barn, and once about money, specifically about a payment Marshall had agreed to make to a supplier without consulting Ada, who had a precise understanding of their finances and a strong opinion about being consulted. The argument about the stallion barn lasted one evening and was resolved when Ada proved her point by demonstration the following morning, and Marshall said, "You were right and I was not," with the directness he had been raised to. The argument about the money was harder and lasted 3 days, not in constant combat but in the careful, guarded way of two people who were still learning each other's sore places. And it was resolved when Marshall sat down with her at the kitchen table with the account books open and said, "I should have talked to you first. This is our ranch and our money, and I made a decision that was mine to make only half of. I am sorry." Ada sat across from him with the account books between them and said, "I am not asking to control everything. I am asking to be a partner in it." "I know," he said. "You were always a partner. I was slow to show it." She nodded, and the careful guardedness eased out of her face, and they stayed up 2 more hours going over the accounts together, her pen moving quick and sure through the columns. And that was, Marshall thought later, the night the marriage became what it was going to be, fully and without reservation. Spring came to the New Mexico territory in the particular way it came there, all at once and with a kind of insistence, the desert blooming almost overnight in the yellow and purple of wildflowers, the Rio Salado running high with snowmelt from the northern mountains, the air losing its cold edge and taking on a new warmth that was different from the dry summer heat, softer and more full of promise. Ada discovered in late February that she was expecting a child, and she told Marshall on a morning when the first real warmth of the year was coming through the kitchen window, and the smell of the blooming chamisa was thick and sweet in the air. She said it plainly, in her way, watching his face. He sat down in his chair. He stood up again. He crossed to her and took both her hands in his and said, with a roughness in his voice he did not try to hide, "Ada." "I know," she said softly. "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am not made of glass, Marshall." "No," he said, with a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more serious. "You are certainly not." He was careful with her in the way that a man is careful when he is frightened of loss, and she tolerated a certain amount of this, before telling him clearly that she intended to keep training horses until such time as she physically could not, and that this was not a point of discussion. He accepted this, with the particular kind of acceptance that acknowledged the argument had already been decided before it started. James and Henry were told at supper on a Friday in March, and James sat very still for a moment with the look of a man doing arithmetic about time and found the answer excellent, and then he got up from his chair and hugged his sister with an uncharacteristic fierceness that made Ada say, "James, I am not going anywhere," against his shoulder, and he said, "I know," and let go. The spring brought other things besides good news. It brought a long, dry spell in March and April that worried the ranchers along the river road, the kind of dryness that made the grass crinkle underfoot and the cattle restless, and the men study the sky with the helpless attention of people who understood they could not do anything about what was happening but could not stop watching for it. Marshall organized a cooperative watering arrangement with 3 neighboring ranchers, sharing access to a deeper well on the Prescott property, which built the kind of goodwill that persisted long after the rain came back. And rain did come in May, a solid week of it that flooded the low ground along the river and filled every dry creek bed and turned the desert roads to red mud for 10 days. And everyone, even the cattlemen who grumbled about the flooding, was secretly relieved. Ada, 7 months along now, trained her last cutting horse in May, a leggy sorrel gelding with a natural instinct for cattle work that she had brought on from nothing, and she handed the reins to Carson with the particular expression of a craftsman finishing a piece they were proud of. Carson shook her hand and said he would be back to her after the baby, and she said she expected he would. The summer deepened, and the baby arrived in the last week of June, 1879, almost exactly 1 year after the race that had started everything. It was a long labor, and Ada was magnificent through it, which was Marshall's honest assessment, and also the assessment of Mrs. Rosa Medina, who had attended more births than she could count, and who said afterward that she had never seen a woman manage it with more sheer will. Marshall spent the night outside the bedroom door in a state of controlled terror that was the worst experience of his life, and when Rosa opened the door at dawn and told him he had a son, and that Ada was tired but well and asking for him, he went through that door and sat on the edge of the bed and held his wife's hand and looked at the small, red-faced, furiously alive creature in the crook of her arm, and found that he had nothing adequate to say. "He is perfect," Ada said, with the exhausted and luminous certainty of a woman who had just done an extraordinary thing and knew it. "What shall we call him?" Marshall managed. Ada looked at the baby for a moment. "Thomas," she said. "After my father." Thomas Carver Prescott was therefore named, and was christened at the Redrock Church in July with James as godfather and Rosa Medina as godmother, and he was an extremely opinionated infant from the very beginning, which surprised no one who knew his mother. The ranch in the summer of 1879 was prospering. The north pasture, properly fenced and rotated, was producing better grass than it ever had. The cattle herd had grown by 30% through careful management, and the breeding animals Marshall had finally arranged from Texas. Walt Gaines managed the day-to-day with his usual competence, and the 2 hands, a young man named Ernesto and an older one called Dutch, were capable and reliable. Ada had returned to her horse training by September, bringing Thomas along in a basket in the shade of the barn with a composure that Mrs. Fitch found scandalous, and that everyone else found perfectly reasonable. It was in October of that year that Marshall first properly understood that Ada's skill with horses was not merely good or even excellent, but was something that might have a larger consequence. A man named Douglas Whitfield arrived in Reedrock from Denver, where he was employed by a large horse trading concern that supplied animals to the Army and to the expanding network of stage lines across the West. Whitfield had heard about the Prescott operation through the kind of informal telegraph that operated through Western livestock circles, and specifically about the quality of the cutting horses being produced under Ada's training, and he came to the ranch in his city clothes and his polished boots with a business proposition. He wanted to contract for trained horses. Specifically, he wanted 6 horses per year, trained to the standard of the sorrel gelding he had examined at Carson's operation, and he was prepared to pay a price per animal that was, as Ada told Marshall afterward with her account book precision, extremely favorable. Marshall looked at the offer and looked at Ada. Ada looked at the offer and said, "We would need to increase the number of horses we are holding for training. That means more pasture." "The South Field," Marshall said. "I have been thinking about it anyway. We would need another hand, at least part-time, who can work with horses." "I know someone," Marshall said. "Ernesto has got a cousin who is looking for work." They talked about it for 2 evenings, and then Ada wrote Whitfield a letter accepting the terms with 2 modifications she had identified, and Whitfield wrote back from Denver agreeing to both, and the Prescott horse operation became a formal part of the ranch's business in the winter of 1879. It changed things, not in the fundamental way but in the ways that accumulate: the additional work, the additional income, the additional conversations required, the way the ranch grew outward from itself like a tree adding rings. James Carver, by this time, had taken on 40 more acres adjacent to the Hartley lease and was running a small but solid cattle operation of his own, with Henry as his partner. Henry had, improbably and at the age of 25, also gotten himself married to a cheerful and formidable woman named Clara, who had arrived in Reedrock in the spring to work at the general store, and who had apparently decided Henry Carver was exactly what she was looking for, a conclusion she reached with a speed that Henry later described as having left him slightly winded. The family was putting down roots, all of them, in this dry and beautiful territory. There were still days that were hard in the way the West was always hard. In the spring of 1880, there was a range dispute between a newcomer rancher named Briggs and the long-established Vega family that came close to something ugly before Sheriff Radnor got in the middle of it with his particular brand of authority, which was mostly the authority of a man who had seen the consequences of range wars and refused to stand by while they started. Marshall and Hector Vega, who had been racing rivals and drinking companions for years, stood together at a town meeting and made the case for mediation, and the dispute was settled by a surveyor and a handshake that nobody was entirely happy with, which, Hector Vega observed, was the sign of a good compromise. There were days when the work was simply exhausting, when the cattle got through a fence and scattered across 3 properties and had to be rounded up in the summer heat, when a horse went lame at a critical moment, when the accounts showed a shortfall that required creative thinking and some uncomfortable conversations with the bank in Las Cruces. These were ordinary difficulties, and they lived through them the way ordinary people do, with endurance and humor and occasional frustration, and the knowledge that they were doing it together, which was the essential fact. Thomas grew from infancy to toddlerhood with the purposeful efficiency of a well-fed child in good country, and he was on a horse by the time he was 3 years old, which was perhaps earlier than was entirely conventional. But he had been watching his mother work horses from a basket since before he could properly sit up, and he appeared to regard being in a saddle as simply the natural extension of being. Ada held him in front of her on Sable at first, and then on a small, patient pony named Biscuit, who had been retired from cutting work, and took to his new assignment with philosophical calm. Marshall watched his son on Biscuit one October afternoon and felt the specific expansion of feeling that comes from seeing something you made become its own thing, independent and singular. And he looked at Ada beside him at the fence rail, and she was already looking at him, and they did not need to say anything. "He will be a horseman," Ada said. "He already is," Marshall said. In the early months of 1881, Ada told him she was expecting again, and this time the news was received with joy that was immediately familiar, mixed with the remembered fear of the first time, but also the confidence of experience, the knowledge that Ada was Ada, and that she would manage whatever needed managing. The second labor was faster than the first, and the result was a daughter, born in August, whom they named Ellen Ruth after Marshall's mother, and who arrived in the world with her eyes wide open, and apparently already observing everything with considerable interest. Thomas, now 2 years old, regarded his sister with a 3-day period of intense suspicion, and then incorporated her into his universe with the pragmatic acceptance of a young child who has decided a fact is a fact. The ranch in 1881 was a different place from the struggling operation Marshall had taken over from his father 6 years earlier. It was not large by the standards of the great Texas cattle operations, but it was solid and well run and respected, and the horse training work had given it a secondary income that made the lean years in cattle less threatening. The south field was fenced and productive. The stallion barn had been rebuilt with proper ventilation. The main house had a second room added to the east side for the children, with good windows that let in the morning light. Walt Gaines had a proper foreman's cabin now rather than the lean-to arrangement he had been living in, and Ernesto's cousin, whose name was Felipe, and who was as good with horses as advertised, had become a permanent hand. There was a particular evening in the fall of 1881 that Marshall returned to often in his memory in the years that followed. It was a Tuesday, nothing special about the day, cool and clear, with the smell of wood smoke beginning and the last of the harvest grasses dry and golden in the pastures. Ada had come in from the barn where she had been working with a new horse, a difficult young gray who was testing her patience in the specific way that only horses who know they are smart can, and she had Thomas by the hand, who had apparently been helping in his own estimation. Marshall had come in from the south field and was washing up at the basin near the back door. Ellen was asleep in the crib. The kitchen smelled of the stew Ada had put on that morning to cook slow through the day. Ada came through the back door with Thomas and said, "That horse is going to be extraordinary, and he knows it, and he is going to make me work for every inch of it," with the particular exasperated admiration she reserved for horses that challenged her properly. "Will you get him?" Marshall asked. "Completely," she said, without a moment's doubt. Thomas announced that he was hungry with the volume and conviction of a 2-year-old who has decided this is an emergency, and Ada sat him at the table and gave him a piece of cornbread, and Marshall poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and brought one to Ada, and she took it with the automatic ease of people who have built a life together, who know each other's rhythms and do not have to think about the small accommodations anymore. They stood in the kitchen together, drinking their coffee while Thomas consumed his cornbread with the focused dedication of a small person taking no chances, and the light was going orange and long through the western window, and the stew smelled exactly right, and the baby was sleeping, and outside the horses moved in the south pasture with the unhurried purpose of animals that are well fed and content. Marshall looked at Ada and said, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him with her patient, direct attention. "I have been thinking about that race," he said. "July of '78. Have you?" she said with the slight curve at the corner of her mouth. "I have been thinking about it a great deal, actually, in a specific way. I have been thinking about how close I came to not going that day. Walt needed help with the east fence that morning, and I almost stayed to help him." And if I had stayed, I would never have seen you win that race, and I would never have asked you your name before the dust settled, and I would have gone on being the finest horseman in the territory, without knowing that somebody was out there who could beat me, and more importantly, without knowing that somebody was out there who was you." Ada was quiet for a moment. "That is a great deal of weight to put on a fence," she said. "I have been meaning to thank that fence," he said. She laughed, the full one, the low and genuine one that still had the same effect on him it had always had. Thomas looked up from his cornbread with the confusion of a child who does not understand the joke but is prepared to participate in the general mood, and laughed too, on general principle. Marshall put his coffee cup down and stepped close to Ada and put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder in the way that was entirely natural, and had been entirely natural for 3 years now. And they stood in their kitchen with their son at the table, and the stew on the stove, and the baby sleeping, and the horses in the pasture, and the whole large life they had built together, stretched out around them in all directions like the territory itself, wide and full of everything. "You were the finest horseman in the territory," Ada said. "I was," he agreed. "And now," he thought about it, "now I am the luckiest man in it," he said. She tilted her head to look up at him, and her eyes were warm and honest and entirely unguarded in the way they had learned to be only for him, the way that still made him feel that stepping through that impossible door in July of 1878 had brought him to a country he had not known existed but would not now leave for anything. "That," Ada said, "is the first thing you have said today that is absolutely certain." He kissed the top of her head, and she turned back to check the stew, and Thomas asked for more cornbread, and the ordinary evening continued on in its beautiful and irreplaceable way. The years that followed were the years of building, the deep and patient kind that accumulates into something lasting. The Prescott Ranch expanded slowly and deliberately, always within what the land and the finances could support, never with the recklessness that Marshall had watched ruin other operations when dry years or falling beef prices came. By 1883, they were running 120 head of cattle and producing 12 trained horses per year for Whitfield's concern in Denver, and the operation had a reputation that brought occasional buyers directly to the ranch rather than through intermediaries, which Ada considered the better business arrangement. Thomas, at 4 years old, was a constant presence in the barn and the corral, and could already name every horse on the property, and had opinions about their characters and quirks that were, disconcertingly often, correct. Ellen, at 2, was a different kind of child, quieter and more observant, with Marshall's brown eyes and Ada's directness, and she had already demonstrated a capacity for sitting still and watching things unfold that her brother entirely lacked. James Carver's operation had grown to a solid 80-acre spread with 40 head of cattle and a reliable income, and he had married in the spring of 1882, a quiet and steady woman named Margaret who had been teaching school in Redrock, and who suited James in the specific way of two people who share the same fundamental seriousness about the world. Henry and Clara had a son of their own now, a boisterous boy named Ned who was Thomas's best friend and companion in mischief, and with whom Thomas had a relationship of competitive cooperation that would have been recognizable to any pair of cousins in any era. Redrock itself had grown through the early 1880s as the territory grew, filling in with new businesses and new families following the expansion of the railroad through the Southern Territory. A doctor had arrived in 1881, a young man named Evers who set up a proper practice in a white-painted building on the south end of Main Street, and who was regarded with the mixture of skepticism and relief that Western towns reserved for new medical professionals. A second church had been built. The school had expanded. A telegraph line came through in 1882, which connected Redrock to the wider world in a way that was simultaneously exciting and slightly disorienting, as though the world had suddenly gotten smaller. Marshall watched the town grow around him with the feeling of a man who had arrived at a destination and was content to settle in. He was not without ambition, but his ambitions had resolved into specific and achievable shapes: the ranch, the family, the work, the community. He was on the town council by 1882, elected in the straightforward way of small western towns, where civic participation was less a political act and more a practical necessity, and he served with the same direct, unshowy approach he brought to everything. Ada was, in the way of the time and place, not directly on the council, but anyone who paid attention to the deliberations of the Red Rock Town Council between 1882 and 1885 could identify, in a significant portion of the decisions made, the fingerprints of a woman who had been doing the thinking before the meeting started. Sheriff Radnor knew it and said so once to Marshall with a dry smile, and Marshall said, "She is usually right," and Radnor said, "That is generally my experience as well," and they left it at that. There was a movement in those years, quiet but persistent, about the conditions of the smaller homesteaders and farmers at the edge of the territory, people who had come west with nothing and were trying to make something on land that did not always cooperate, and who were vulnerable to the kind of pressure that men like Drummond, who had not gone away but had simply retreated to his 60,000 acres, could still apply. Ada had opinions about this. She spoke them at church meetings and at the informal gatherings that served as the territory's town halls, not loudly but with the precision and the evidence that made them difficult to argue with, and Marshall backed her up with the particular kind of public support that was, in 1882, one of the more useful things a respected rancher could provide. It did not fix everything. The territory had injustices built into its structure that were not going to be addressed by one woman's clear thinking and one rancher's endorsement. The rights of the Mexican families who had been on this land for generations before any American arrived were not well protected, and this was a wrong that Marshall understood and acknowledged, even when the legal mechanisms to address it were limited. The Apache people who had lived in these territories for centuries and who had been pushed further and further by the advancing tide of American settlement, were in a condition of dispossession that weighed on him when he thought about it with honesty. These were large wrongs, and the people living in the territory day by day could address the edges of them without reaching the center, and this was an unsatisfying truth that Marshall had made his peace with imperfectly and continued to think about. What he and Ada could do was what they did, which was to be fair in their own dealings, to pay fair wages, to treat the families who worked with them as partners in the practical way that expressed respect without requiring language that the era did not have ready to hand, and to use whatever influence they had built to point things in directions that were more just rather than less. It was not enough, and they both knew it was not enough, and they did it anyway with the consistency that was the only kind of honesty available to them. The gray horse that Ada had been working in the fall of 1881, the one who was going to be extraordinary and knew it, turned out to be one of the finest cutting horses the Prescott operation ever produced. She named him Logic, which was characteristic, and he was sold to a Texas cattleman in the spring of 1882 for a price that made the ranch's annual accounts look notably healthy. Whitfield in Denver wrote to say that Logic's new owner was telling everyone where he had come from, which was the best form of advertising. Ada accepted this information with satisfaction and immediately identified the next horse that was going to require her full attention. The race was run again every 4th of July, and Ada rode Sable in it every year through 1882, winning the first two and placing second in the third, which had been a genuinely close contest against a young Mescalero Apache rider named Tomas, who rode with a skill that Ada freely acknowledged was as good as her own. They shook hands after that race with the mutual respect of two people who have discovered a worthy opponent, and Tomas and Ada talked for a while at the stable afterward about horses, in the way that people who love horses talk to each other, across whatever other differences exist between them. Marshall watched this exchange and felt something warm and right about it. The way that the land and the horses and the work of them could create a common ground that existed outside the rigid social structures that made so many other connections impossible. By 1884, Sable was 12 years old and had been retired from racing with great ceremony and a great deal of carrots, which was her most significant vice. She continued to be Ada's primary riding horse for another several years, and her descendants, by way of a careful breeding program that Ada managed with the same precision she applied to everything, became part of the Prescott remuda and were regarded as some of the finest horses in the territory. In the fall of 1884, Ada told him she was expecting a third child, and this time the news was received with the comfort of familiarity and the joy that does not diminish with repetition. The third child, born in May of 1885, was another son, named William after Ada's maternal grandfather, who came into the world with an almost suspicious tranquility that made Rosa Medina, who was still the woman the community turned to for births, say that this one was going to be trouble of the patient and planning variety rather than the immediate kind, which proved to be an accurate assessment. Thomas at 6 was deeply interested in William's arrival and immediately appointed himself the primary authority on the question of horses for the new baby, a role that William did not yet have opinions about but that Thomas felt should be established early. Ellen at 4 regarded her new brother with the careful observation she brought to most things, and then announced that he had a very good nose, which was a verdict that remained unexplained, but was received with the seriousness it apparently deserved. The mid-1880s were the time of Marshall's life that felt, when he looked back on them from later years, the most fully themselves, the time when the children were young and the ranch was humming with the particular busy contentment of a well-run place, and the territory was still the territory, still wide and unfinished, still with the quality of possibility that had drawn so many people to it, and that was, by the end of the decade, beginning to be replaced by something more settled and less wild as the railroads came further in, and the towns grew and the wide spaces filled. He was aware of the change happening and was not entirely at peace with it. The part of him that had grown up riding fence lines and reading weather by the color of the sky was resistant to the taming of the landscape, even though he understood that the taming was inevitable, and that in many ways he and Ada and everything they had built were part of the process. He said this to Ada one evening, and she said, "The land does not become less beautiful because more people can find it," and he thought about that for several days before concluding that she was right, as usual, though the conclusion did not fully ease the feeling. Cannon died in the winter of 1885, peacefully in his stall at the age of 18, which was a good age for a horse who had worked as hard and as consistently as he had. Marshall sat with him for a while in the cold barn and thought about everything that horse had carried him through, and then came inside and said nothing about it for a day before Ada asked him directly what was wrong, and he told her. She listened and then put her hand over his on the table and said, "He was a great horse," with the simple and accurate acknowledgement that was the right thing to say. He was replaced, after a suitable interval, by a young black stallion that Ada had identified and that Marshall trained himself, the way he had not trained a horse from scratch in several years, rediscovering the patience and pleasure of it, the specific conversation between a man and a horse that had been the first language of his life before everything else. The year 1886 brought the formal organization of the New Mexico Territorial Horse Breeders Association, which was the first of the professional organizations that would eventually bring more structure and legitimacy to the horse trade across the territory. And Ada was among the founding members, which was unusual enough for a woman that it was briefly a subject of discussion at the organizational meeting before Hector Vega, who was also a founding member and who had spent 8 years watching Ada Prescott produce extraordinary horses, said flatly that the quality of the operation spoke for itself, and that any organization that did not include it was a less useful organization. And the discussion ended. Marshall was not a man who stood behind his wife. He was a man who stood beside her, and this was a distinction that Ada had once articulated and that he had taken to heart. He made this clear at the founding meeting by sitting next to her at the table and participating in the discussion as an equal party to the Prescott operation, which they both were, and which was, he thought, simply the accurate description of what they had always been. Thomas, 9 years old in 1886, was already riding in the junior events at the annual race day, and he had inherited a precise mixture of his father's physical boldness and his mother's technical intelligence that, combined, made him a rider of unusual promise. Ada watched her son ride in those years with an expression that Marshall recognized as the one she used when she was seeing something she had hoped for but had not been certain of. The summer of 1887 was the year of the great drought that struck the whole Southwest, and that altered the cattle industry in ways that took years to fully understand. Marshall had seen dry years before and managed the ranch accordingly, but this was a different order of severity. Months of no rain and relentless heat that bleached the pastures to nothing and drove the cattle down in condition week by week. He sold a third of the herd in August at reduced prices, the hardest business decision he had made since taking over the ranch. But he made it without hesitation, because holding them through another month of no rain would have been catastrophic. Ada agreed with the decision and had arrived at it independently before he raised it, which was their usual pattern. The horse operation saved them that year, in the practical sense. The Whitfield contract held, and a separate commission from a stage line in Arizona provided enough income to carry the ranch through the worst of the drought without debt. They came out the other side thinner than they had gone in but intact, and the following spring brought rain and the pastures came back, and the cattle herd rebuilt itself over 2 years back to its proper number. Walt Gaines retired in 1888, which was a genuine loss to the operation, not catastrophic but felt. He was replaced by a man named Arroyo, who was 40, experienced, and had been running a smaller operation of his own until a bad investment had forced him to look for work. Arroyo was quieter than Walt and somewhat more formal, but he had the same quality of steady competence that Marshall valued most in a foreman, and by the end of his first year, he had earned the trust of the hands and of Marshall and of Ada, who was the hardest judge. It was Arroyo who noticed, in the autumn of 1888, that the gray stallion they had acquired for the breeding program was showing signs of an inherited hoof condition that would limit his useful life as a breeding animal. And it was Ada who understood the implications for the lines they had developed from him, and spent 3 months reconfiguring the breeding program to minimize the damage. She did it with the thoroughness and clear-headedness that she brought to every difficult problem, and when she was done, she had not only corrected the issue but had identified a path forward that was, she believed and Whitfield later confirmed, actually stronger than the previous program had been. "You turned a problem into an improvement," Marshall said, reviewing her notes at the kitchen table one winter evening. "The problem showed me where the weakness was," Ada said. "I would have found it eventually anyway. The stallion just made me look sooner." This was her consistent approach to setbacks. Not optimism exactly, which was too simple, but a kind of methodical refusal to concede more ground than was actually required. And it was one of the qualities he loved in her with a particular constancy, the way it held against pressure without losing its suppleness. Thomas at 12 was riding in adult events, supervised and with Ada's hand on the reins of expectation for him, managing his development with the careful patience she applied to horses, knowing when to push and when to hold back and how to build confidence without building arrogance. He was going to be a great horseman. This was no longer a hope but an observable fact. Ellen at 10 was a reader, which had come as a slight surprise given the family's general orientation toward practical work. but which made complete sense when you considered that she was fundamentally a person who needed to understand things, and books were the fastest available technology for that purpose. She read everything she could find, which in Raydrock in 1889 was the school's small library, the teacher's personal collection, and whatever came through the general store, and she pursued this with the same focused intensity her mother brought to horses. William at 4 was the patient planner that Rosa Medina had predicted, a small person with an expression of perpetual assessment and a capacity for strategic patience that occasionally unnerved adults. He had recently spent 3 weeks planning and executing a campaign to convince his father to allow him a second portion of pie at supper, which had involved careful observation of the variables, identification of optimal timing, and the eventual deployment of a logical argument that Marshall had been unable to counter without simply asserting parental authority, which he had done, but not without acknowledging the argument's quality. Ada said he would either be a lawyer or a general, and that both were equally plausible. The decade turned, and the 1890s arrived in the territory with the feeling of a chapter closing and another opening. New Mexico was still a territory and would remain so for 2 more decades, but the character of the place was changing. The wild distances slowly domesticated by telegraph and railroad, and the multiplication of towns and farms and ranches, the open range giving way to fences everywhere, the wild game thinning, the landscape reshaping itself around the persistence of human habitation. Marshall was 38 in 1890 and felt, physically, very much the same as he had at 28, which he attributed to the work, and Ada said was probably also the horses, which kept a person young through the combination of physical demand and the obligation to be mentally present at all times. He was grayer at the temples, and there were lines in his face that had not been there in 1878, and he looked, Ada told him once, exactly like a man who had done something useful with his years, which he took as the highest possible compliment. Ada at 35 was, in his completely objective assessment, more beautiful than she had been when she beat him in that race, not because the years had been unkind. They had not. The sun and the work had given her a weathered fineness, but because the life she had lived had added itself to her face in a way that was its own beauty. She rode Sable's daughter now, a palomino named Copper who was Sable's image, and when she was in the saddle she was still the same rider she had always been, technically precise and utterly in harmony with the animal beneath her, the kind of rider you stopped what you were doing to watch. The annual race was still run every 4th of July, and had grown into a larger event with the town's expansion, drawing riders from 4 counties now and carrying a respectable prize. Thomas won it for the first time in 1892 at 15, on a horse his mother had trained, in a time that was the fastest the course had been run in its history, and he crossed the finish line and immediately looked for his parents in the crowd, with an expression that was young and unguarded, and entirely unlike his usual teenage composure. Marshall found Ada's hand beside him in the crowd and held it, and she squeezed his fingers without looking at him, her eyes on their son, and he thought about July of 1878 with the particular vividness that the best memories retain across time. Thomas's win was the kind of thing that a territory talked about for months, the Prescott boy on the Prescott horse in the Prescott time, the lineage visible and legible in the performance. Marshall accepted the congratulations with the genuine pleasure of a father, but deflected them mostly toward Ada, who had done the training, and toward Thomas himself, and people who knew the Prescotts well found this characteristically accurate. The years built on each other with the comfortable, dense accumulation of a life properly lived. Ellen, growing up in Raydrock's expanding school system, and then with a year of formal study in Las Cruces, arranged by Marshall with the kind of careful financial planning that Ada approved, became a teacher at 17, and was running the Raydrock school at 20, which was the age she was in 1899, and which she did with the thorough intelligence and genuine love of the work that made her students' parents stop complaining about the young teacher within 2 months of her taking the position. William grew into the lawyer that his early strategic thinking had predicted, and by his early 20s had begun reading law under the guidance of a Las Cruces attorney who recognized the same quality in him that Rosa Medina had observed when he was 4. The law in 1900 in the New Mexico territory was still a growing thing, imperfect and sometimes rough, but William approached it with the patience and persistence that were his distinguishing traits, and Ada said he was going to make it better rather than merely practice it, which was exactly the right way to use a talent for patience. Thomas, at 23, was managing the horse training side of the Prescott operation with the skill and judgment that had been growing in him since childhood, and had taken it in new directions, expanding the relationship with Whitfield's concern and developing connections with the new automobile-era sports that were beginning to replace some of the traditional markets. The world was changing around the horses, and Thomas understood the change without being threatened by it, which was his mother's ability expressed in a new generation. The ranch in 1900 was a different place from what it had been in 1879, and was the same place too, the way that all living things that are well tended are different, and the same across time. The main house had grown, a proper dining room added in 1891, a study for Ada's horse business records in 1894, a covered porch along the south side where the family gathered in the evenings when the work was done, and the light was going long and golden over the pastures. The barn was the second barn, rebuilt in 1890 after the original one had developed a failing roof that Marshall and Ada had agreed was beyond repair. The corrals had multiplied. The pastures were well managed and the grass was strong. There were mornings in those years when Marshall woke before dawn and lay in the dark of the bedroom listening to the sound of the ranch coming alive, the horses moving in the pasture, the first birds, the creak of the house settling in the early cold, and he thought about the particular sequence of events that had produced this morning, this room, this woman breathing quietly beside him, this life in all its accumulated richness, and he felt a gratitude so large it was almost alarming. He was not a man who spoke easily about feelings of that magnitude, but Ada knew, because Ada had always known things about him that he had not said. That was one of the enduring conditions of loving her and being loved by her. And on the mornings when he lay in the dark with the weight of that gratitude, she would sometimes, without waking fully, shift toward him in the way that had been their language for 20 years and put her hand on his arm. And that was the conversation, complete in itself. The way their best ones always were. On the 4th of July, 1900, 22 years after the race that started everything, Marshall and Ada stood at the fence of the race road with their grandniece on Henry's side, a 4-year-old named Bess who was deeply interested in horses and had been placed on Ada's hip for a better view, and watched Thomas in the starting lineup on a gray horse that was Cannon's line, 3 generations removed, and felt the whole weight and lightness of those 22 years simultaneously. The pistol fired. The horses thundered, the crowd roared. Thomas went to the front in the first 100 yards and stayed there, and he crossed the line in first with the same ease his mother had crossed it in 1878, and the dust came up golden in the July sun, and little Bess on Ada's hip squealed with delight at the horses and the noise, and Ada laughed, the full one, the low and genuine one. Marshall turned to look at her, his wife of 22 years, the woman who had beaten him in a flat race and given him her name before the dust settled, the woman who had argued with him about fence posts and rebuilt breeding programs and raised 3 children and helped run a territory horse operation of genuine reputation and stood beside him through drought and dispute and the ordinary extraordinary difficulty of a life fully inhabited. She turned to look at him at the same moment as she often did, and her dark eyes were warm and bright and directly honest in the way they had always been, and she said, because she could see what he was thinking in the way she always could. "Are you feeling sentimental, Marshal Prescott?" "Extremely," he said. She shifted Bess to her other hip and put her free hand in his, the one with his mother's ruby ring that she had worn every day for 22 years, and the dust from the race was still settling around them, gold in the summer morning, and the crowd was cheering for his son, and the territory spread out all around them in its ancient, beautiful, sun-baked amplitude. And Marshall held his wife's hand and thought that of all the things he had ever done in his life, the finest had been walking through that July dust in 1878 and asking a stranger her name. The finest horseman in the territory, who had been beaten on the first race and knew it and was grateful for it every day of his life. They stayed at the fence until the dust had fully settled and the crowd had moved on toward the town and the day's celebration, and Bess had fallen asleep on Ada's shoulder, and the horses were back in their stalls, and the race road was empty and still and golden in the morning sun, and there was nowhere in the world either of them would have rather been. They walked back into town together, their family gathering around them as they went, Thomas with his winning smile and his father's eyes, Ellen with a book she had somehow been reading between events, William with the quiet assessor's gaze that still occasionally made adults feel they were being fairly evaluated, and Henry and Clara and James and Margaret and the children of children, the whole warm accumulation of the years. And the town around them going about its 4th of July business with the cheerful noise and ordinary humanity of a place that had become home, fully and irrevocably, in the way that places do when you have loved people in them long enough. Ada walked beside Marshall with Bess still sleeping against her shoulder, and she looked up at him once more as they turned onto Main Street, and she said, quietly, only for him, "Still the luckiest man in the territory." "The very luckiest," Marshal Prescott said, and he meant it with everything he had, as he had every day for 22 years, as he would every day for all the years that remained, with the absolute and simple certainty of a man who had been given, through luck and love and the grace of one extraordinary morning on a dusty race road, exactly the life he was supposed to live.